So I'd like to welcome now Neil and Carmel to tell you a little bit about their experiences of working together. Thank you.
Now, thank you, Joe. It really is a great honour to be here with you and hearing some of the powerful stories from the last couple of days. I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Wally Ellis, who died recently in Brisbane. Wally was brought up in rural Queensland. He worked for Queensland Rail as a young man. Somehow this mysterious phenomenon called mental illness ravaged through his life as a young man, and when we at A Place to Belong met him nearly 10 years ago, he was living in a supported accommodation facility in Brisbane. A little later, Wally was hospitalised in an acute mental health ward, and over the months appeared to us to be deteriorating in his mental health. We had a worker visiting Wally regularly while in treatment. The worker's name was Malcolm Hunt, and he listened to Wally. Malcolm heard Wally say a number of times, "All I want is a home of my own." Here is the central principle for our presentation today about fostering freely given relationships. In our desire to help, to care, to support, the interventions can easily be sabotaged by our often middle-class desires and agendas. We want to be messiahs. We want to rescue. We want to see progress for our efforts. We want to get runs on the board for our marketing. But we essentially need to listen. So Wally's quietly spoken plea some years ago in that acute mental health ward was for an ordinary and typical human resource when he said, "All I want is a home of my own." After years of living in supported accommodation where his room was insecure, his possessions were unsafe, where he was surrounded closely by other vulnerable and fragile people, he simply wanted a home of his own. And I'm so glad our worker Malcolm listened. So we appealed to the mental health team, who fortunately agreed that after many months of this acute mental health ward treatment, that this was not a recovery space for Wally. Here is a second principle for fostering inclusion: to gather and garner whatever resources we can, to present options, to come up with creative options that we can give to the systems. Appeals were made to government, resources were provided for us to support Wally on his discharge. Public housing provided a unit, and we pulled together a team of workers and others who then began working with Wally towards setting up his home. So fragile was he in the early couple of years that we found it difficult at times to form a support alliance with him. One year, the primary common ground we're able to find with him, the primary agenda we're able to work on with him, was that he wanted a holiday. He kept saying, "I want a holiday, Neil, I want a holiday. I want to get out of town." So again, like having a home of his own, this is an ordinary and typical thing, but it was also highly risky. However, a holiday to Cairns in North Queensland was organised and went well. The next year, Wally again was quite fragile and quite challenging to be with, and we were only able to support him on a brief holiday to the Gold Coast. So worn out was one of our workers after that time that he came back and he resigned on the spot. In the couple of years since then, some of the seeming tiny but significant threads of community connection that evolved around Wally were firstly relationships with his neighbours. Sometimes his relationships with his neighbours around his flat were tested and challenged, but he was known and he was supported by some of his neighbours. Secondly, we found out that garage sales, Saturday morning garage sales, were an open space for Wally. Meeting people under their houses or in their garages on a Saturday morning and picking up cheap deals for his home was a highlight for Wally. Finding a local church where he sometimes went was another additive for Wally. Finding a girlfriend from the hostel where he used to live meant that Wally had some companionship. At the time of his death, Wally had asked her to marry him. And Wally enjoyed the company of one of the volunteer constituents at A Place to Belong. Wolf is a retired truck driver who likes to hang around our agency, helping out wherever he can. Wally met Wolf and they got on well, and Wally invited Wolf to regularly visit him at his flat. So in dedicating this presentation to Wally Ellis, I'd like to share some of the learnings that I take from our experience of working with him towards freely given community relationships. Firstly, as already mentioned, was listening to him when he said to us in that acute mental health ward, "All I want is a home of my own." Secondly, as a community agency, we initiated suggestions and put ideas on the table to the treatment team, and we gathered and garnered whatever resources we could. Public housing became available, support dollars were allocated by government, helpers, volunteers, workers were gathered around when Wally left hospital, and we provided 24-hour support over those first few months. Anyone who's here from government, please hear that resources for community organisations working on the front line with vulnerable people are invaluable for working towards the good life. Every dollar can go a long way. Often mental health treatment teams are caught up with the treatment modality, often in an illness-saturated environment. There's heightened awareness of problems, violence and risk, and there's a common concern for control and for containment. And so in that context, community organisations are inherently placed for suggesting a different vision and a positive vision and a creative vision and a community-based vision, and for asking that those resources be placed on the table. Thirdly, we worked with the agenda of ordinary and typical and wholesome needs that Wally shared with us. I wouldn't have selected a holiday to Cairns early in our work, but that's what he wanted. And so we had to work through and talk through with him. How would he last the long plane flight to Cairns without a cigarette? How would he handle all that security at the airport, because he gets freaked out by uniforms and people in authority? How would he handle the crowds around him at the airport and the crowds at tourist places up in Cairns? What if a mental health crisis occurred when he was far from home and a long way from his mental health treatment team? Well, I'm pleased to say we didn't say no to the risk. We worked with Wally's request, we planned with him, we safeguarded carefully as best we could, and in the time we supported him, he had 2 successful holidays to Cairns. Fourthly, we flew lots of kites. We tried lots of things. We tried a variety of strategies. I wouldn't have guessed that Wally would have enjoyed garage sales, but he did. One of the workers went with him along to a garage sale and he loved it, and so that became a regular fixture. Lots of things we supported him to experiment with. He did not enjoy, but garage sales he did. So we flew lots of kites. Then came 4 years of supporting Wally, living in his unit. At his funeral recently were a collection of people who've got to know Wally over the past 4 years, and a couple of family members. Malcolm Hunt, the worker who listened to Wally when he was in hospital and said, "All I want's a home of my own," and who gathered people around Wally when he first came out of hospital, wrote to us and said, "I will remember Wally for his sense of humour and glimmers of deep wisdom that would flicker through the shadows of his illness. I remember him for his real care for people, even after times he had offended them. Again, his illness entrapped him inside himself, and the frustration of this would then overflow. That was natural. However, deep inside was a man who cared. Those who knew him closely would know this. It was a place to belong, and the dedicated team around Wally," Malcolm says, "that gave him a new breath of fresh air from the institutional environment in which he spent much of his time." So I dedicate this presentation to Wally. Some of you may have read Mackay's latest book, What Makes Us Tick. This is a useful read for any of us involved in Australian community life. Hugh Mackay lists the 10 most fundamental needs that drive us: the need to belong, the need to connect, the need to contribute, and so on. He says that these needs don't work in a hierarchy or don't work in a linear process, except for one of them. And he says one of the 10 needs is fundamental to the other 9. The one need which we each have, which comes before all the others, he says, is the need to be taken seriously. And the best way we can take others seriously, Mackay suggests, is to listen to them. He argues that if any of us want to help change or improve the world, the most basic thing we can do is listen to others. I found that a profoundly interesting insight. Talking to people who want to change the world, he says the best thing any of us can do in being a world changer is to listen, which is the way that we can show that we're taking others seriously. If he's right, we have a direct connection here to the mandate of our conference here today. When responding to people who are disadvantaged or isolated, marginalised or stigmatised, our first challenge, our highest calling is to listen and thus to take people seriously. And then to bring in others, not to do charity, not to rescue, not to save, but fundamentally to bring in others who will also take this person seriously. Some of us here are service providers. Wally Ellis's story affirms what Mackay suggests, that our first calling also as service providers is to listen to the people who we seek to assist. Some of us are family members and advocates and carers who are here. We need to listen first as well, and this gives a backdrop to our concern to facilitate people's inclusion, that the fundamental need is not to connect people just so they'll be assisted or supported, but it's so they can be listened to as human beings and engaged with as human beings and taken seriously in their own community. Some of you would recall Kim, who shared with me here yesterday. And Kim, I think it was clear in his story, as a person whose sense of identity was overtaken by being a psychiatric patient. I suspect the turning point for Kim from his story he shared yesterday was when he began to be taken seriously. And he told us yesterday that being invited to my home, being invited to garden, being shown confidence and being trusted, being invited to community events were profoundly important process for him at that particular time. He felt he was taken seriously. Well, now I'd like you to meet Carmel. So Carmel's been sitting patiently here beside me. Carmel got to Brisbane Airport at 10 to 5 this morning, was it? So you set the alarm for?
4.
Carmel set the alarm for 4 o'clock this morning so that she could be here with you today. Thank you, Carmel. So up early this morning, out to Brisbane Airport, caught the plane down to Melbourne, got the Sky bus into the city, got a taxi across, and the taxi dropped her off at the wrong entrance. So
The wrong building.
The wrong building. So it took a while before I was able to locate Carmel at morning tea this morning, but we're ever so pleased to see each other because I didn't want Carmel to miss out on this. I need Carmel here. Well, Carmel, you've been here for a little while. You went to a session just before lunch.
Yep.
And you found that pretty useful, you said?
Yep.
So we've been talking about how powerful this conference is and how great these people are and the important things that people are doing here around Australia and around the world. And you enjoyed the session before lunch?
Yep.
Excellent. So we feel like we're amongst friends here, eh? And,
Yep.
And want to thank you for being willing to come and tell us a bit about your own adventures and journey and your own life. Even though it's a bit freaky up here with all these faces out here and this scary microphone here, I think your story will really connect with the audience here. So thank you for that. So
Do you know, to start off with, you owe me a carton of Pepsi Max?
I hadn't heard this was part of the deal. You get told what the deal is a bit after the fact. Well, I'll be happy to shout you some Pepsi Maxes, Carmel. That's one of the addictions you have. As you might have noticed, Carmel over lunch was hoeing into the Coke. Good on you, Carmel. So, Carmel, you've shared your story with me before, and would you feel comfortable to tell the people here a bit about your early life and some of the chaos that you endured in your upbringing? Perhaps you can tell us a bit about that, and then we'll have a guided conversation from there.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Carmel.
I was brought up in a sexual assault family who my father abused me, and that went on for years. I when I was born, my parents took me away, and I was brought up with my grandparents and then my godparents because I was told that my mum was too sick. But then I found out that she was pregnant again 3 months after me. So I thought, that doesn't make sense. And I was running away from home and trying to yell out to say there's something going wrong. And in the middle of all that, my grandfather came and lived with us. And I was the happy kid on the block. And I was going to a state school, Ashgrove State School, and in grade 4 I was still doing grade 1 work. And my grandfather realised that I couldn't read or write. So he called the child guidance to come in and test me. They did, and the outcome was for me to go to an opportunity school. I was called spastic. But, sorry.
That's right, you're doing great, doing a great job. Just not sure why we're getting this feedback.
It's, you know, those words hurt. And I kept on running away from home. I started hitting the cops.
Hitting the cops?
Yeah.
How old were you then?
I started when I was 12.
Pretty gutsy 12-year-old, eh? Hitting the cops.
But they didn't listen.
They should have been here to hear this talk, eh?
Yep. And then when I was 13, I was sent to a child's detention centre called Sir Leslie Hospital at Wilston. And I was there for 6 months, and I spoke up about what was going on at home. And I still remember my dad denied it and my mum overdosed. And I had to go up to Lowson House, and it was a psychiatric hospital at the Royal Brisbane, with 2 social workers, and I had to tell my mum and my dad what I said again. And my dad did threaten me, but I still remember that room. There was a bench along here, 2 chairs and another bench. There was me, there was my mum, there was a social worker, there was a doctor and a nurse, another social worker, and my dad. And I had to repeat what I told. But I couldn't talk, so I got called a liar. And then I was sent back home to my family when I got told that by one person that I shouldn't be sent back. But I did. And I kept on running away from home, drinking, taking Valium and syrup packs. And then I ended up in I was going through hostels, psych hospitals, boarding houses. And then I got involved with an organisation called the Lena Project. But before I went there, you know, I knew it was Anglican church based, and I thought, I didn't want nothing to do with church. But the coordinator said to me, what is my dream? And I said, I wanted to be a cop and I wanted to be a doctor. And she said, why do you want to be a cop? To lock up my family and chuck the key away. Why do you want to be a doctor? To write my own scripts.
Imagination, creativity, positive.
Then she said, but Carmel, you can't read and write. How can you do that? And she said, what I can offer you is a first aid course with a support worker to help you. And I thought, bullshit. Who would do that? But they rang Red Cross, told them that I was coming with a support worker, and they did coughed it up. I had a support worker. And I still remember the instructor from Red Cross, Keith. He was a darling. At the exam time, he said, I'm putting you all into small little rooms. And And he said to Diane, Diane, you tell Carmel the questions. Carmel, you give the answers to Diane. Diane, you write them. No one never done that before. And I passed. And that was the first thing I ever passed.
How old were you then?
25.
25. Okay, so this was the first course you'd done, you successfully completed, you were 25, and they provided flexible support for you to get through that. Okay.
And then the coordinator said, I can take you 1 hour a week to help you to read and write. And again, I thought, crap. You know, I'm 25, I'll never be able to read and write. But to her faith and her persistence, I can read and write today. And, you know, I still have problems with my spelling and grammar. And sometimes my emails to Neil is critic. You know, he has to work out what I'm trying to say, but he gets there.
Eventually. No, you do well.
And so I started to learn to read and write when I was 25, and then I had this passion that I wanted to teach other people that they can read and write too.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, Carmel, is that in the midst of this incredible chaos and mess, there was mental health stuff, there was criminal stuff, there was heavy stuff at home, really, really deep stuff at home. You wanted people to listen, you wanted people to understand, you didn't feel like people were. And from what you're saying, a turnaround point happened when a service provider said to you, what's your vision?
Dream.
What's your dream? Okay, so someone asked you a strategic, open question.
Yep.
And listened to you. Is that right?
Yep.
So instead of seeing you just as a menace or a problem person or a person with challenging behaviour or someone to restrict and contain, she said to you, what's your dream? And that you responded to, and instead of demeaning your dream and putting it down and saying that's silly, she actually worked with that and said, if you want to get towards that, to be a doctor or a police person, you need to learn to read and write. And how can we assist you to do that? Is that right?
Yep.
And then she provided a first step, a flexible, supported first step,
Yep.
by which you were able to take a small step and achieve something that was special for you and pass a course, and you've then continued on from there learning to read and write. Is that right?
Yep.
So I think what we're seeing there is how service providers can listen and respond to and work with people's dreams. Is that right?
Yep.
That's great to hear, Carmel. Fantastic. Okay, so this was the Lena Project, which was a small community organisation in Brisbane that was responding to you at that time. Tell us what happened then.
Well, I was with the Lena Project for a while, and I was still drinking, still taking pills, and I knew that soon I could be getting kicked out, and I was, you know, getting homeless again. So my support worker found me a community centre, a community house in West End, and there was conditions to it that I wasn't allowed to drink and I wasn't allowed to take pills. And I thought no one would never know.
Very crafty.
So, and it was a group of individual community people who worked part-time, who wanted to help people on the edge. And we were invited to a housewarming party, and there was going to be alcohol there, and they knew that I couldn't go because of the alcohol. Emma, who was one of the women who lived there, said, "I'm not going to the party, Carmel, I'm going to the pool. Would you like to come?" I thought she was mad for giving up a drinking to take me to the pool. But that showed me love, hope, and that someone will give up something to help me. And all the way through it, that there was someone there helping. And then the house was called Bristol Street, and we had two mentors who came, Chris Brown and Dave Andrews. And Chris Brown invited me home for dinner because we moved into the area the same time, and they used to live at the Gap, and they wanted to take on a role of supporting someone in the community. And I went over, and they didn't realise, who I was, and I didn't realise who they was. Marilyn was talking to me about whereas they used to live. And none of my family knew where I was living. And Marilyn said to me, where I said we lived at Ashgrove when I was a little girl and moved after the floods. She said, "What street?" And I said, "Acacia Drive." She said, "What number?" I said, 230. And she said, "Have you got a brother named Lawrence and a sister named Teresa?" I was petrified because they were my brother and sister. I wasn't sure if she was a witch or a spy, and that my family would find me and I'll be in danger. And the next night we had house night at their place, and I went home that night and I wrote up Jenny and I said, "Jenny, Marilyn and Chris knows my family. They can't. And then I found out their name was Brown. And when I went over the next night, I went into the kitchen to Marilyn and I said, "Marilyn, you're not Marilyn, are you?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, who am I?" And I said, "You, Mrs. Brown." And they were the ones who helped us in the 74 Australia Day floods.
Okay, so what we're hearing here, Carmel, is here you are in the early 90s in a share house in West End in inner Brisbane, and you're meeting up Chris and Marilyn Brown and realising that they're the couple who assisted your family when you were a little girl in the 1974 floods in Ashgrove. Is that right?
Yep.
And so what's happened here is we've heard about the service provider who assisted Carmel, beginning by saying, "What's your dream?" and supported you flexibly, and you learnt to read and write. But a significant thing the service provider did here was they linked Carmel, as she said, to a community household. So there was a community household in West End where you went along to meet them, and they invited you in, and you moved in. And here we see a really significant, important moment where Carmel's actually become connected to a community by being invited into a share house of young people who are committed to the household. So that's what Carmel was sharing about then. And one of the mentors for the house is Chris Brown. When you go to his place and meet up, you realise that he and his wife Marilyn assisted your family when you were a little girl 20 years earlier in 1974. Is that right?
Yeah.
So he's an amazing meeting up 20 years later. Okay, tell us what happened from there, Carmel.
Well, they were my support people. Then they turned into friends. Now I'm the family. I'm the lost daughter. And that's not just with Marilyn and Chris, that's with their children, their grandchildren, and their parents. Christmas time, I'm with them. Celebrations, I'm with them. My birthday, I'm with them. And when they moved from West End to the Sunshine Coast, I thought my life would be terrible because they're gone. and I was trying to work out ways how I could keep them here. I was going to let their tyres down. But thinking about it, and I thought, well, they're only moving to the Sunshine Coast. I could get free holidays. And I do.
So this is an amazing story. So we're hearing here not only a powerful role of service provider in supporting Carmel to do courses and learning to read and write, but also connecting Carmel to a community context which is open, welcoming and supportive, and having people who will go with her swimming into a pool to help her avoid a tempting situation at a party. So they're supporting you through the process of trying to overcome drinking issues. But in the process as well, Carmel meets up with people who become mentors, close friends, and actually welcome her into their family. So after the early years of pain, alienation and violence in her own family, Carmel has moved away from her own birth family, and she's now found another family who've basically adopted you into their family, Carmel,
Yep.
and you're one of them. So at Christmas time, Carmel is with Chris and Marilyn each year, and their sons and daughters are her brothers and sisters. Is that right, Carmel? Okay, so we're hearing this amazingly, profoundly important story, not just about the role of service providers and powerful role service providers can provide when they're open and asking strategic and strengths-based questions, but also connecting people to community engagement, which is meaningful, positive, healthy and hopeful, where you're impacted in your identity by people saying you're valuable enough to miss a party, Carmel, but also you made friends and one particular family actually welcomed you into their family. Is that right?
Yep.
Just an amazingly powerful story. So, tell us what else happened. I know there's been other vocational things happen around reading and writing too.
I wanted to get off the pension about 20 years ago because I was on the disability pension. And I went to the disability officer at Centrelink and they said I had to go to Commonwealth Rehab to see what they can offer. And I did, and I told them that I wanted to do community development work. And the case manager I had said, "What's that?" And she said, "If you find your placement, we'll fund it for 3 months." So I knew Neil and Chris and Dave, and they were doing community work and Jared in the West End community. So I went and said to them, "I've got 3 months funding, could you take me on?" And they said, "Okay." My role was to go into the hostels to ask this question, what I find very difficult because we always get asked with disabilities, what is your needs? And nothing never happens. So I thought I need to be more creative. And I thought, well, they don't know me, I don't know them. So I told them a bit about my story, how I'm just starting to learn to read and write and been in hostels and that. And they said, "We want what you got, Carmel, but we don't want to go to TAFE at all." And I took that back to my team and they said, "Well, go and find funding." And I thought, where do you look? So we heard about this little bucket of funding from the Department of Education and Training. So every 6 months we put funding in. We started a reading and writing project in West End. And it's been running now for 18 years? 18 years. I employ a worker, a teacher, and I'm the consultant. And people with disabilities come and we learn together on a Monday and a Tuesday. And that's my vacation now. Like, I want to give hope and encouragement to other people. Let's fight together. Let's work together with people to help us to learn and to read. We're important too. And, you know, yesterday, I started my first community service, Cert 4. And Neil has given me the opportunity to do that with support, with my colleagues and people on the committee and people of my friends. And in 2005, we lost all funding because of the reading and writing, because our funding, they said, our outcomes weren't good enough. We had a guy who started talking, a guy who wanted to lead the community service church at his local church with someone. He started writing all these little outcomes, and to me they were huge, but they weren't with Department of Education and Training. That same time when we lost the funding, someone nominated me for the Disability Awareness Award, and there's only 3 individuals a year in Queensland, and I got one of them. And that was my proudest day with Ron Pitt, and Disability Services, seeing, yes, I do have a learning disability, yes, I do have a mental illness, and yes, I work in the field. But to be recognised is the best thing.
Fantastic, Carmel. Wow. So out of this whole community experience, not only have you felt supported and accepted, you've become part of your community, but you've also received the opportunity to develop a whole vocation in literacy and numeracy.
Yeah.
And you're seeing week by week an incredible process where people are learning stuff and accessing TAFE and going on to other things from that early process that you're leading people into. Do you want to tell us, what would you recommend to this audience here about how can we foster freely given relationships, the kind of stuff that has helped you in so many ways? How can we each, find a way forward there? How can we be assisting people to be engaged in community?
Listen, hope, faith, and not to give up. You know that we can work together, service providers, families, carers, people with a disability. But we with disabilities really aren't disabilities. We are just normal people. We might have some challenges, but he has challenges too.
Dad, I know it. Great, Carmel. Well, that's a very, very powerful story. And so what were the things you said? We need to listen, have faith, hope. And persistence. And there was something else.
And that we are normal people.
Right. Okay, great. That's a great message, Carmel. So there'll be a question time in a few minutes. People might actually want to ask you some things, Carmel, but that's great to hear your story for now, and because that really says a lot to us about how we can be involved in fostering community relationships. Shall we give Carmel a clap for thank you? Well done. Good job. So there will be questions, and I'll go a bit longer and we'll see what questions people want to ask you. Okay? Well done.
Can I sit down?
Yeah. So from Carmel's story, a couple of significant domains I think that we see there. Firstly is the service provider domain, that a service provider helped turn the cycle for Carmel. She was in, I think, a pretty chaotic kind of cycle, Carmel, but it was that question where someone said to you, Carmel, what's your dream? And then worked with that, worked with the aspirations and hopes and provided flexible support. Another significant domain we hear in Carmel's story is the whole community domain, that where she was taken seriously. She was valued, as she said. People said to her, Carmel, can we miss that party and go swimming together as a way of helping you avoid that tempting situation with alcohol? She was befriended and supported, eventually even to discover her own vocational pursuit. And that's just loud and clear in Carmel's story. So I think there are two significant domains that I want to point out there today, and which point out some keys for our own involvement. Firstly, if anyone here, those of us here who are service providers, we can work with imagination, with hope, with a strengths perspective. We can provide resources and flexible supports. We can validate, affirm and support people's positive engagements with community and with ordinary relationships. So those of us who are engaged in service provision, they would be some of the things that I would suggest that we can work with, and we hear that loud and clear in Carmel's story, and I've heard it loud and clear in so many other stories yesterday and today as well. But secondly, in terms of community relationships, we've heard in Kim's story yesterday that the identity of being a psych patient, he said, was disturbed and moved and transitioned by community people validating him, where he felt accepted and listened to. And we hear it in Carmel's story again today, that community experiences help shape the identity that a person has. They provide respect, they provide enriching opportunities, and provide people with the amazing spiritual, emotional, social and vocational benefits that we find impossible to quantify or to measure. You know, I hear Carmel's story here today, and I listened to Kim's story yesterday, a number of other stories from our time here, and just hear the power. There's something spiritual and soulish and deeply meaningful in this whole belonging kind of process, which engages people and helps people to move through important shifts in their own sense of who they are. So there are some keys for our involvement. And you may like to ask Carmel some questions about that in a few minutes' time. But a helpful model that I draw from in this whole debate and this whole discourse, I've borrowed from Laurie Curtis, and her mental health recovery model depicts two circles. And on the left, and I think we heard this from Kim yesterday, was a sense of there's me, and he said my identity, my sense of identity was as a psychiatric patient. Carmel, you talked today about your life and being overwhelmed by the addictions you had and by the chaos and the disorder that was there. And so where we want to move to, and the mental health recovery model, I think, is something about this transition of moving to a life where there's a range of interests and a range of capacities and a range of involvements, a range of engagements, where there might still be a sense of vulnerability. Kim told us yesterday that he still accesses mental health treatment occasionally, so there's still a sense that Kim needs support and needs help from that particular system. But he also told us about line dancing, he told us about living in a new town, he told us about his cats who he loves, he told us about connecting up with his sisters again. So he has a whole range of other aspects in his life as well. And Carmel, I think that might be true for you as well, that you have a whole range of involvements and engagements which are positive and healthy, which have assisted you in your own recovery process. So I find this model useful, and I think the transition arrows, the arrows that help people transition between those two states, are things like having secure housing, are things like having friendships and having relationships, are things like people supporting people to express their strengths and their aspirations and their hopes. Those kind of community relationships help shape the identity that people have, as I've already indicated, and help people move through that kind of transition. So that's a very simple model, but I think it's one that shows where community inclusion and mental health recovery kind of connect in terms of people's sense of who they are. Another model I draw from in terms of this community engagement is this iceberg model. I draw from this iceberg model, which shows the tip of the iceberg above the water, and above the water is what is seen. This is what is public, and this is a person's presence. We know that many people who are disadvantaged or people with a whole range of challenges are present in our community and are seen. That's what's above the water. But it is just presence. It doesn't mean there's deep engagement. The belonging section of the iceberg is way down the bottom, way below the water. And it's deep down, it's hard to see, it's hard to quantify. It's kind of that mystical, that soulish, that spiritual kind of area that's called, you know, I have this sense of what it means to belong. It's hard to quantify belonging, it's hard to measure. We can't contrive belonging, we can't coerce it. There's no formula which will help us move towards creating belonging. But that's the part of the iceberg that's deep down beneath the water and it's hard to see. The connecting point between belonging deep down and presence above the water is a really important thing for us to keep in mind in terms of this model, and that is, I think, that we can assist people to move from presence to belonging by supporting a person's participation. And I think that that middle section of the iceberg is a key place that shows us where we can be involved with isolated people. If we can be supporting the opportunities for people to be engaged with others, to be participating in their local community, that won't necessarily create a deep sense of belonging, but it is a step towards it. And the hope is that from those links and connections that a sense of belonging will arise. So a simple framework which I shared yesterday and which we typically work with is, firstly, our work begins with vision. It doesn't begin with technique, it doesn't begin with method, it doesn't begin with science, it begins with vision. It begins with a sense of imagination. Carmel talked about hope and faith, and so this is where the work begins. It begins with faith, belief, imagination and hope for a better future. I don't know how you found this conference, but I've found this conference inspiring and helping to rebuild my hopes for my work. And I'll return to Brisbane with a deeper sense of hope to re-engage in my work, and that's critical. Secondly, we need to then work at creating, nurturing, finding, developing the opportunities for connection that people can have. So our vision must translate into opportunities for the people we're assisting. These opportunities may emerge from our thinking or from the person themselves, from the support networks or from the context, from people around. But they need to be found, cultivated, nurtured and worked with. And thirdly, an essential element sometimes is to provide support for those opportunities to be sustained. We want these responses to develop and move on, and so we need to search and look for whatever kind of support is needed. Let me tell you a story about how someone worked through exactly this process. Not someone who works with a place to belong, but a worker I know in Brisbane who worked through that three-stage process and really worked with this amazing statement that discovery is the art of seeing what everybody else has seen, but thinking something different. I think Cam's father yesterday, Mark, demonstrated this when he said he looked at Cam and noticed that Cam was waiting in the lounge room, waiting for a worker to come by. And so Mark was seeing what everyone else had seen. He was seeing his son wait in a lounge room, but he thought something different. And there was something amazing at that moment where he articulated to us here yesterday that he saw his son waiting, but he discovered, he saw what everyone else had seen, but he thought something different. He said, my son has the capacity and the gift of waiting. How can we work with that? And that would be a profound example we heard yesterday of someone working to this exact formula of seeing what everyone else has seen but thinking something different. And he thought, my son has the gift of waiting, and out of that emerged the whole notion of a business for Cam to be waiting. This particular worker in Brisbane who I'm talking about was working with a man who'd just come out of long stay psychiatric hospital and moved into a block of flats, and the man was saying that he wanted to meet some of his neighbours. So the worker was chatting with him about how can we support this process, how can we support you to meet your neighbours, and they thought about a couple of ideas, maybe just going along the hallway and banging on doors and saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, I've moved in, and they thought, no, that's a bit too forced, we don't want to do that, and they didn't like the ideas they had. But the worker noticed out the front of the man's block of flats, beside the letterboxes was a park bench. He saw what everyone else had seen, but he thought something different. And he recognised in that park bench, as Cam's father recognised seeing Cam waiting, he saw something different. He said maybe that park bench is the opportunity to actually connect with neighbours. What he'd noticed was that whenever the mail person came by each day and delivered the post, people from within the block of flats would totter out and get their mail and then wander back in, and that was right beside the park bench. So he suggested to the man, how would you like to sit out there after the postie's been, and we'll see if we can meet any of your neighbours. And the man agreed. So they sat out on the park bench beside the letterboxes, and sure enough, when the postie came along, people came out to get their mail and they were able to greet some of his neighbours. Those initial conversations continued. They sat out there a few more times, and in that process the man was able to meet and greet some of his neighbours. He would then bump into them when they're taking their wheelie bins out on garbage night, chat a bit more. He'd meet them, bump into them in the hallway, and out of those very initial tiny threads of engagement, that man got to know some of his neighbours. Two of them became close friends, and over the next couple of years he became good friends with two of his neighbours. That man died 2 years later, and the support worker says that at that man's funeral were a number of his neighbours, 2 of whom had become close friends. And I've checked this story with him a few times to make sure that I'm not making it a bit too big, but he says, no, that's true. Simply by sitting at the park bench and finding a simple way to meet neighbours, that man met his neighbours, some of whom became close friends. And so that worker was working through that 3-phase model. He had vision, he was working with the opportunities and planning with the person, and then supporting the person through that process. So let's take this discussion a little further. I think there are many frontiers that we can work with towards deeper inclusion. Many, many, many frontiers, and I'll just name a few here now. We've heard many already at this conference in the last couple of days. Firstly, we've already talked about the importance of listening and watching. Cam's father watched his son and noticed that he was good at waiting. Carmel, you had a service provider who asked you, what is your dream? And they didn't demean your dream or deride it, they worked with it, and through listening and watching, they were able to work with an important agenda. Wally Ellis, who I mentioned at the start of my presentation, said to the worker when he was in an acute mental health ward, all I want is a home of my own. And so Malcolm, his worker, worked with that. So simply listening and watching is critical. Secondly, we can work towards inclusion in planning. I noticed in Pat's presentation that for one of her stories yesterday, there was a wonderful story about planning, and there were photos of plans and pictures on the wall and people meeting around a particular person to do planning. And you had a sense that the planning process wasn't a contrived and monitored and sterile process. It was actually a very inclusive and very much a vision building process. I think we can aim for inclusion even as we plan with people and try and make it as less formal, as less contrived as possible. One of the people we supported, A Place to Belong, who Carmel knows well too, Deborah, she loves having pizza nights. A couple of times a year we put on pizza nights, and really that's another word for planning. And she'll say to us, I'm ready for a pizza night, which is her way of saying, can we do some planning? So normally at these pizza nights we get in a few pizzas, and Deborah invites the people she wants to be there at the pizza night. One pizza night I turned up, and who was there but one of her local chemists. She got to know her chemist down in her local street so well that when it was time for pizza night planning, she invited her chemist along. Another time she invited her local video shop staff along, and because she's got to know them so well. And so Deborah's in charge of her planning. She lets us know when she wants planning done, and she invites people to that process as well from her own local community. So paid workers, paid supports, a meeting with some of her own community allies as we go about that pretty creative and imaginative process of planning, isn't it, Carmel? Thirdly, we can work towards inclusion in the everyday course of our life, in the everyday course of our work. Just picking up opportunities as they occur. Workers who are spending time with people can just work with imagination and creativity and simply responding to and going with the opportunities that are there. The park bench story I mentioned to you a few minutes ago is a classic example of a worker as he went about the everyday course of his work with this man, taking a few minutes here or there to sit at that park bench and enabling the man, supporting him to meet some of his neighbours. So in the everyday course of our work. A fourth key frontier for inclusion is through supporting guides and anchor people. We've heard a number of stories here at this conference of particularly family members being anchor people as they've been assisting their son or daughter or brother or sister. Many of the people we work with at A Place to Belong don't have family involved. Matter of fact, both Kim and Carmel's story you've heard today and yesterday are both of people who've moved away from their families of origin. And so many of the people we're working with have no or very, very little family support and have no or very little paid support. And so a critical place to work is to support any anchor people or guides who are there in a person's life and to resource them, support them, nurture them, validate their role as much as possible and to assist them in the work that they're doing. I saw this happen in my own home. This is a story from my own personal life. When my wife's mother began to develop the early signs of Alzheimer's disease back in 1994, and my wife was meeting with her siblings talking about what should happen for mum. and I think the agreement was Mum will just go into some sort of retirement situation, some sort of retirement village, and so she did. She went into a place and very quickly began giving signals that she didn't like it there and didn't want it. Out of listening to her mother, Penny, my wife, put her hand up and said, let's see if we can keep Mum in our local community. She then began talking with her husband about the idea of his mother-in-law moving into our house. Now, her husband likes speaking at conferences like this and likes talking about inclusion, but when his wife comes to him and talks about, shall we have mother-in-law move in, he was a little hesitant and he was quite cautious. And while he loves speaking about it and challenging people about practicing what they preach, he was, I must say, a bit slow off the mark. But Penny was a key anchor person. She was a key guide, and she wouldn't give up. So eventually, he kind of relented and gave the bare minimum and said, let's try it for a month. And so, my mother-in-law moved in. And you know what? It wasn't too bad. It wasn't that bad. It went okay. We had a number of complicating things happening for us. We were on the list, the Family Services adoption list in Queensland, and we were having a young baby to adopt coming to us very soon after that, and I was very aware of that. But Ben, our first son, was adopted and came into the house while Mum was with us, and 1 month went by, and then we tried another month, and then a third month, and before long 6 months had gone by, and then a year. And we began to get used to the chaos of 3 generations in the one house. And then we adopted our second son, and things went on. During this whole process, Penny was putting out the word and inviting people to come and assist and come and be involved. And we put a note out in our local community newsletter, inviting anyone to come and help out. And a fellow who just moved up from Melbourne, actually, who'd moved into the area, rang up and offered to come in and spend time with Penny's mum. Penny met him and checked him out, and he was clearly a very peaceable and tranquil kind of character, just ideal for Penny's mum. So he began coming over one afternoon a week, reading poetry and having cups of tea with mum and massaging her feet. And before long, one afternoon became 2 afternoons, and then 3, and before long we met his wife and his children, and that kind of thing happened in a few different ways, where local community people began to engage with us and support us with Penny's mum, increasingly as her support needs enlarged as well. Anyhow, things went well until the 5th year, and then I began feeling a deep inner sense of impatience and a lack of, I guess, a lack of commitment to continue, and I began to resent what was happening in our household, and it took me a few months to articulate that to Penny, but eventually I said to her, I feel more like your support worker than your husband. And fortunately she listened to me and said, well, it may be time for Mum to move out. Anyhow, a discussion was held around Penny's siblings and the family, and Penny's brother down in Canberra agreed to be primary carer, and Mum was to fly down to Canberra, and nursing home room was booked, and we felt, well, the vision had been for Mum to live and die at our home, but it has come to an end. We can't sustain it any further. Plane flights are booked, room in Canberra was booked, and then about a week before the end was to come, we had a knock at our door, and there at the front door was this local guy I mentioned to you who'd been coming over and helping us out with Mum, and he was there with his wife and saying, we believe in the vision. We've loved having your mum live in our local community, and we're offering, if you'd like that, to keep her here. We're offering to have her in our house. We're offering to care for her as though she was our mum, if you and your family would like that. And it took Penny a few days to process that and to cope with the incredible offer that it was. But what had happened was Penny was an anchor person. She was a guide. She was standing up in our community saying, let's welcome my mum, and that had gone on for 5 years, and even when it came to the time for us to pull the plug and for Mum to move out, someone else stepped up to the plate and offered to have Penny's mum live with them. Well, discussions happened around Penny's family. 2 of Penny's brothers couldn't cope with the thought of another family caring for their mother, and since that day they haven't spoken to Penny. It caused a huge rift in the whole family. But some of the siblings supported Penny and agreed, and so this local family took Penny's mum in, and I thought they might last a month or 2. They had Penny's mum with them for 7 years, And when it came time for them to leave town, and we had Penny's mum back in our place, and by that stage she was in the bed the whole time, and she died 3 months later in our lounge room. So just an amazing story of Penny's mum being able to live in our local community for those 12 and a half years. And it happened because there was one person who was an anchor person who was putting the flag up saying, let's see if we can do it. And we didn't know if we could do it. I thought I could last a month, but Dee was in our local community for that 12 going on 13 years. So in our role towards inclusion, we can support and encourage and nurture and validate the roles of anchor people and guides. Another frontier for inclusion is through local community projects. And let me tell you a story about a powerful example of engagement here. In 2005, A Place to Belong organised a community project. We without realising that the project itself would be a powerful agent of transforming inclusion for one particular isolated person. We had a couple of cyclists offer to raise mental health awareness in Queensland, and they put together a team and rode their bikes from Brisbane to Cairns as a way of arousing interest and education around mental health. As we were planning the bike ride, a case manager rang me up and told me that he was working with a man who was experiencing profound anxiety issues, but who was passionate about cycling. And he'd heard I was organising this mental health bike ride from Brisbane to Cairns. Could they come over and discuss it with me? I said, fine. I still remember having a cup of tea with the case manager and the particular man he was working with, whose name was Steve, and we met at that table. You saw the picture yesterday under the tree out the front of our building where my office is, and they came over and we met. Nice guy, but he was training at that time about 30 kilometres a day, and I was looking for riders who could ride 150 to 200 kilometres a day. So I nearly said to him, no, go, you'll never make this. But luckily I said something like, well, you've got 6 months. If you can build up, maybe you can join the team. So Steve was this guy's name. He built up. He got in the saddle and away he went. Only a few months earlier, he'd been too anxious to go to his letterbox. He'd been secluded in his unit, curtains closed. His brother would do his shopping for him, and he was too afraid, too anxious to even go to his letterbox. But the key to his engagement was his passion around cycling. As a young man, he'd been an elite level cyclist, and here he was in his early 40s, re-engaging with mental health recovery and wanting to get back into cycling. But he could only do 30 kilometres a day. By May that year, by May 2005, he built up to doing 150 kilometres, and he went on a trial ride with the team of cyclists. Steve, another Steve in the group, rang me, the leader of the group, and said to me, Neil, Steve is ready, he's up to the ride. So here we were at the launch. This is the launch of our bike ride in July 2005, and at Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane, Anna Bligh came to launch the ride, and she rode to Redcliffe with us on the first day, and a whole groups of local community groups and mental health groups supported us on the ride in that first day. And there on the left-hand side of the photograph is Steve, this man who'd been so anxious only a few months earlier that he couldn't walk to his letterbox. The other cyclists, high-profile business people. One was training for an ultra-marathon. Another was Anne Garton, who's second from the left, who's in the Australian triathlon team. But here's Steve, who's built up to be part of this ride. And away we went. That's the starting line, with, again, Steve on the right-hand side. And as we went up the coast, we visited towns and spoke in schools and Rotary clubs. And here's a group up in Bundaberg who were welcoming us, and the mayor greeted us, and Steve was all part of that ride. Just a epic event, absolutely epic event with Steve riding almost the whole way. Here we are up in Rockhampton. That's Steve with the yellow jersey on, crossing the Tropic of Capricorn. We met a number of politicians on the way. The guy third from the left is one of the local members on the way up. He rode into town with us, the final 10 kilometres, and there's Steve on the left-hand side. Again, mixing as part of this community project, meeting politicians, meeting business people, speaking to the media. In one town, we had ABC Radio speak to us, or two towns actually, and Steve got to speak at Rotary groups and a range of schools and a range of other places. Coming into Cairns with the local police escort at a local town near there. Page 2 of the local paper the next day after we'd spoken in town was almost all of Steve's story of what his own mental health recovery was about. when Steve finished that ride, his confidence had been so lifted that he got back to Brisbane and said, I want to get a job. He'd had a doctor tell him only a year or two earlier, Steve, you will never be off the disability pension. And here he was within a year or two saying, I want to get back to work. So he went to a disability employment agency and asked for assistance, and they made an appointment for him to come back 2 weeks later to watch a video on how he could develop his own resume. Steve said, I don't want to wait 2 weeks to go and watch a video on how I can develop my own resume. So he got the local paper, looked at the job ad column, saw there was a job for a gardener, rang them up. They said, are you fit? He said, I've just ridden my bike to Cairns. They said, you've got the job. So he then had a job as a gardener on Brisbane's south side busways. He was given a ute and a whole box of tools and other things, and his job was to go up and down the busway, trimming hedges, mowing lawns and keeping the gardens clean. He did that job for a few months and then decided he was ready to go back to his trade in printing. So he went and applied for jobs and got a job, a full-time job in printing. And a few months later, his boss called him in and said, Steve, we don't want to lose you, you're a great worker, can I give you a raise? So here's this man who has been through profoundly disabling mental health conditions and who's been told he will never be off the disability pension, who through his engagement around an aspiration and a gift he has around cycling and a passion for cycling, is back in the work scene and in full-time work. This very week, Steve in Brisbane is meeting someone from a mental health support agency who wants to employ him as a peer support worker. He feels a real, it's time for transition, that he wants to get into mental health recovery work. And so he's still in full-time work. He's now married and has a 4-year-old child, and I was cycling with him just last Sunday. So that's some of the frontiers for inclusion, including community projects. All right. So where do we find people? Where do we find people in our local communities? We mentioned yesterday how we've de-skilled ourselves in modern suburban Western society with all this community stuff. How can we include people in communities if communities are not really connected? How can we do this work? Where can we find people who want to get on board with this vision? Well, I think firstly, we can find people in the person's own networks. Often when I'm working with an isolated person who's asking for connection, I'll spend time and listen and watch and see whether they're already engaged. I'm working with a man called Matthew who feels quite isolated and said he wanted us to assist him to be better connected. Through meeting with him, I knew that he already knew some people. And so we talked about that and agreed that a way to go would be to invite the people he already knew to see if he could spend more time with them. So we put on a pizza night, invited the people he knew along. We had a quiz about Matthew, and he shared. I supported him to share with those people his need for friendship and how he'd like to spend time with any of them who might be available. Out of that night, a number of people made offers and have been since spending time with him. Sometimes we can work with our own personal networks. I know a worker in Queensland who was supporting a man who loved rugby league. The worker knew the local president of the local rugby league club. She introduced the man to him, and before long he was assisting at training, carrying water for the players on the games, and travelling around country towns with the team, supporting them as a water carrier, having a valued and a valuable role. And he was also, this is a Melbourne touch to the story, this man loved the Melbourne Storm, supported the Melbourne Storm Rugby League Club, and so as an award to this man for his assistance in that club, they paid for him to have an air trip to Melbourne a couple of years ago to watch one of the semi-finals with the Melbourne Storm playing. So that was a worker working with their own personal networks that resulted in that incredible inclusion. We can work with our agency networks. There are people across our agencies or across our networks and groups who we can ask and we can invite. One of the men on my management committee has just finished working. He's now got plenty of time, and so of course we're nabbing him, and he's already spending time with someone who needs inclusion. We can work with local community networks. We can find networks that are there. I was working with a man who was wanting inclusion, and he loved art. And I happened to know in a local community network near him a local artist, a local community artist. So I got them together, and before long that community artist was introducing him to others and assisting his inclusion. We can work with colleagues networks. Around our agency, we're constantly asking each other, who do you know? Who do you know? And we can ask our colleagues and people we work with for contacts. We can work with embedded citizens. I'm working with a man who's in a secure unit, a lock-up secure unit in Brisbane right now, in a suburb a long way from where I live and from where I work. How do I respond to him? How can I help build community links around this man who's locked away and been locked away for 3 years? Well, I happen to know a local youth worker at a local church near that place, and this local youth worker knows heaps and heaps of people in that local community, and he's led me to people who can be involved with this man. So embedded citizens and very connected citizens. I'm working with a man who's a refugee from Iraq and who's experienced profound disabilities and such that he couldn't get to his mosque. So in working with this man, we worked with an embedded contact, a young Muslim woman who we know, and within 2 phone calls she'd been able to find people who could take this man to his mosque. So where do we find people? There's a range of places where we can find people in our local communities who can be involved. I just mentioned a man in a lock-up ward, and the question is, where can community be found here? This man's been locked away for 3 years. The mental health treatment team don't feel comfortable with letting him engage with others, but they've asked us to be involved, and within a year of working with this man, he's gone from being allowed out of the unit for only half an hour a day with a psychiatric nurse, just for that half hour, to now he's allowed off-site by himself for regular day leave, and that's happened simply through the process of bringing community into him. Sometimes I can't take people out to community because of these lock-up situations, but I can take community in. And I found a man who lived not far from that particular unit, who's been visiting him regularly and going shopping with him. And then I found someone else who's also ready to be engaged in community, who's been willing to visit him. We had a student on placement who was visiting him regularly, and when the placement finished, he said, I want to keep visiting Anthony. Can I keep visiting him? And so we found 4 people over this last year who've been engaging with him, building those tiny threads of contact. So if you can't move out, you bring community in, and that's what we're trying to do in that situation. And that man, later this year, we're hoping will be discharged. So this work is more than strategy, it's a matter of the heart and the spirit.